Hello gang, Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight, I've got 3 real reports from viewers describing strange experiences and encounters with unidentified creatures. Now these true accounts, well, they come from upstate New York, North Carolina, and Upper Michigan. Now just a little warning before we get started, because what follows contains graphic descriptions of mutilated animals, frightening, traumatic experiences, and even mention of PTSD and self-deletion. So viewer discretion advised. Now if you're still in, grab your boots and let's ride. Number 1. Dear Biker, I have a strange experience from my youth that I wanted to share with you and the community. You see, I lived in a small neighborhood in upstate New York while growing up. One weekend, my parents were out of town, so I was at home alone. My backyard was half cleared land and half dense woods. There was a small creek that ran behind my house too, so there was lots of wildlife around. On the first night, around 1 a.m., I was on the couch in the extended living room part of my home, where 3 of the walls had windows, and we had a skylight there. This is important because I had a complete view of almost all of my backyard up to the tree edge, including the moon overhead, which was a waning crescent that night. I heard the sounds of a very angry squirrel for about 5 minutes, and I kind of brushed it off because, well, I've heard angry squirrels before. And then I heard the most terrifying screech I'd ever heard. It sounded almost like a goose that had been murdered and was screaming. It scared the crap out of me, and I immediately rushed over to the windows to see if I could spot anything. I was worried it might have been a wolf, since my neighbor's cat likes to go wandering outside and usually kills a rabbit or 2 and then leaves them in our front yard. It was pitch black, and my porch light barely illuminated anything but our back porch. But I brushed off the noise and went to bed shortly after. The very next morning, I headed over to my neighbor's house, who had hunted before and occasionally would bow hunt as well. I asked if they had heard the noise last night, and they said yes, and they thought it was a deer crying for help. They told me they were going to investigate the woods in a few hours to see what had happened. I was at first reluctant to ask to go, but I was determined to know what that noise had been. A few hours later, my neighbors and I went into the woods. We didn't have to go far when we saw a dead squirrel, pretty much ripped into pieces. We continued on, figuring that squirrels don't have much meat on them, so the animal probably had tried to get as much as he could out of it. We wandered about 5 more minutes, and then we came across 5 dead rabbits, a deer corpse and her fawn, and a dead goose. Now this frightened me the most. 3 of the dead rabbits had just their heads missing, and the body was still intact. The other 2 were ripped to pieces, similar to the dead squirrel. I almost gagged at the smell of it all. I didn't dare walk towards the goose or the deer. My neighbor, who had a bow on him, walked towards the does to see that she had long claw marks all along her torso, and her head had been mangled. The fawn, however, had its head missing completely. Now the weirdest part of all the dead animals was the goose. The goose, it was fully intact, except that it looks like its lungs had been ripped open, and all of its inner organs were gone. My neighbor's wife immediately called the police and said that a bear was roaming the property and was attacking innocent animals. Now I had my suspicions, but I don't believe this was a bear. My neighbor, who had the bow, was keeping a clear eye on the surrounding woods like he was watching for something. His wife paid no attention to this and continued talking to the police. And then I was hit with a feeling of dread and chills. Now New York gets cold in the morning, but this was summer, and the humidity was usually around 90%. The entire woods seemed to be silent as well. We were actually near the creek and couldn't even hear the water flowing either. I could see my neighbor had the same feeling wash over him, as he raised his bow and loaded an arrow. He told his wife to be quiet and for me to stand back. I couldn't see anything, but that feeling was still with me. Now my neighbor, I know, saw something, but he refused to tell me what it was since I was 15, and he probably didn't want to scare me. After a few minutes, the feeling of dread was gone and the sound of something moving through the forest could be heard in the distance. That's when my neighbor lowered his bow and told us that we had to leave. Now. We immediately listened, and by the time we got back to the small neighborhood, the town police had arrived. My neighbor explained the story, and the police advised us to stay inside. They later sent a few animal control people out to survey the area to try and get the bear away from the neighborhood. Of course, they came back empty-handed. I never knew what it was that was out there, but I've done some research, and I believe it might have been some sort of sasquatch by the dead animal killings. My neighbors refused to talk to me about it ever again, and my neighbor who had the bow seemed really cautious anytime he was outside after that. This happened a few years ago, and I live in a different state now. Signed, Jason. Number 2. Dear TB, I live in west central North Carolina, specifically at a location that's very close to the Yadkin River here in Davie County. The river's floodplain comes to my property line in a valley that has no houses and is very heavily wooded. However, 2 roads to cross it to get to my house. The river's edge is primarily undeveloped, with almost a 300-yard flood area clearance on both sides for miles and miles. Now this river floods pretty regularly, and there are high-voltage power lines running across the area as well. Now that the stage is set, let's go. We've also put a game camera out to see if we could catch anything on it. So far, we've caught a fat pregnant deer, several raccoon, and a gray fox. That pregnant deer has twins now. They've been through our garden. The deer are pretty thick around these parts. This isn't a hotbed of Bigfoot sightings, but I've been hearing something very large walking in the woods beside my house. My dog has been kicked by something and was knocked out for a few seconds. All we heard that night was a thud, as it sounded like he was kicked in the side. We didn't see anything, as it was around 11:30 on a moonless night. A few moments later, he was up and chasing the scent down the neighbor's field. My son grabbed his flashlight and looked around down at the woodline, and that's when he caught a pair of large, red-orange eyes reflecting back. We went down later to investigate where they were. Now there's an opening right where he saw the eyes, and we determined that whatever it was had to stand either 4 feet tall if it was standing in the field, and around 9 feet tall if it was standing in the woods, as the opening has a steep drop-off to the tree that he used as a reference point. The last explanation is that whatever it was in the tree at that level. Now we're hunters, and we spend a lot of time in the woods. We've never seen a pair of red-orange eyes around here. Not sure what a bear's eyes look like, but we don't have a bear population around here. I often stay up late and go outside to look around with the flashlight around 3 or 4 in the morning. I've heard on 3 occasions a very loud knock following my spotlighting around it. It sounds like 2 large rocks being banged together, not like a rock hitting a tree. They have come from 3 different spots down in the backyard behind the woods. The knocking sounds are only heard about once every 8 to 12 days. Kind of like that whatever it is only passes through the area on some kind of schedule. Not sure if that sounds logical or not. I have only on 1 occasion heard what I would call a howl. It was off in the distance, but was extremely loud and drawn out. And whatever it was, definitely wasn't a coyote. Not even close. This thing has a completely deeper tone, and it lasted far too long. I would love to hear a logical explanation for all this. Signed, Kenneth. Number 3. Hey TB, this happened when I was about 12 years old and to my uncle. He's no longer with us and, well, I really want to share his story because I think it's important and I think he would want me to. Growing up, I lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on 5,000 acres of farm and ranch land that was backed up into a state park. Nothing but miles of forest and pasture could be seen. Needless to say, it made us pretty tough, and it takes a lot to spook us up here. We are all avid hunters, fishermen, and outdoorsmen. Being the only girl, I was raised as a tomboy, and I'm just the same. My uncle went off to join the military, becoming a senior NCO in a prominent Special Forces division of the U.S. Navy. He was 6'4", built like a pro wrestler, and obviously skilled in survival tactics, and, well, nothing really rattled him. He was at home on leave and went out hunting as it was deer season. I remember him coming in the house shaking and crying, saying he saw something out in the woods. My uncle never cried. He was tough as nails and would tear someone to shreds before he'd let them make him cry. My grandma tried to get him to make sense, but he kept saying he saw Bigfoot mixed with a wolf. My granny immediately got my grandfather, and he rounded up the rest of the guys, including my dad, a few male cousins, and my uncle, who was still terrified but went because he didn't want to be considered a chicken. They got all their shotguns and ammo and saddled the horses to go clear the woods. Apparently, they were aware of the dogman, but I was still young and blissfully ignorant of such things. They told me to stay inside, and for no reason. I was to step outside of our house until they got back. I never heard my dad or grandfather so serious, so being afraid, I hid in my room. Sunset comes, and they still aren't back. And I'm really worried at this point because they never stayed in the woods long after dark. Shortly, I heard the sound of the horses running to the barn and the sound of their voices. I was so relieved. They looked troubled when they came into the house, but they didn't say anything. Probably not to spook me. At dinner, my dad laid down the law that I was no longer allowed to play outside or go out to the barns alone. I had to have my grandfather with me at all times. Of course, I was upset by this and felt my independence was getting taken away, but I obeyed. The next morning, my dad and grandfather taught me how to shoot, so I knew that whatever it was serious. I overheard the adults talking the next night. Apparently, there were tracks where my uncle had his sightings. Much bigger than any wolf could ever make, but they were definitely canine-like tracks. As I said before, the whole family was very outdoorsy, and they can easily identify tracks, but they couldn't identify these. About 8 feet up in a tree, there were claw marks. No Michigan bear could make those. We also found claw marks about the same height on multiple trees throughout our property. There were cattle that had been mutilated, and not in the way that a coyote or bear would do it, and that lasted the whole winter. We probably lost about 30 to 40 cattle that year, all of them completely mutilated, and all with the same huge wolf-like tracks in the snow. Now, I really feel like this experience changed my uncle. Who knows? He did multiple tours in the Middle East for Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was before he committed suicide. After that experience, though, he was never quite the same. He went from not ever drinking to never seeing him without a bottle of Jack, and his eyes always had this haunted look. He changed his personality, and after that one time, he never went out in the woods again. He quit hunting and eventually just quit coming home to visit at all on leave. He didn't even come home for my dad's funeral just 2 years later. It was heartbreaking to see him deteriorate the way he did. And looking back, I truly believe that he saw something out there in those woods, and it ultimately and slowly killed him. Thanks for taking the time to read this, biker. Signed, Barbara.
And there it is.
3 real reports of strange experiences and unexplained encounters with unknown creatures and cryptids. So, what'd you think about these? I can't wait to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments down below, but please, keep it respectful to the witnesses. And if you have a true story about an unexplained experience or encounter that you'd like to share with us, just send it to the email address in the description, and your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks so much for riding with me tonight. I really appreciate you. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker.